interbred Indians, creating mixed-blood generations.
As soon as white men start to appear, they don't leave their emotions and their lust behind. And frequently they married, especially those who planned to stay for a reasonable length of time.
One of the most respected mixed bloods in the Creek tribe was William Weatherford, 7/8 Scottish and 1/8 Creek. Weatherford believed in Tecumseh and became a leader of the Red Stick Warriors, known as Chief Red Eagle.
He spoke, of course, both the Creek language and English, and he was adept to some extent in both worlds, certainly the Creek world. And he was a very dynamic, well-respected man.
In August 1813, after Red Sticks began attacking settlers and Indian sympathizers, some 550 sought protection inside Fort Mims in what would become Alabama. 300 were white, including 175 militia, and 250, nearly half, were mixed bloods and Creek Indians.
It was a civil war. You know, in the Civil War the United States had, we had brothers on both sides. This was just another civil war, and I think they probably laid around outside Fort Mims deciding on what they were going to do. They were there in that area for several days before they attacked Fort Mims, and then it just happened.
On August 30th, Red Sticks invaded the fort, pouring through a gate stuck open by drifting dirt and sand. When news spread of the attack, it was described as a massacre of whites by Indians. No mention was made of the Indian victims or about a tribal civil war. As the closest military unit to Fort Mims, Jackson's Tennessee militia was ordered to Alabama to fight the Red Sticks. Their first encounter at the Creek village of Tallahatchie was as brutal as the attack on Fort Mims.
Jackson enticed the Indians to come out and to attack him. His boys came out on either side with their guns from the woods, and they had the Indians on three sides surrounded. There was great bloodshed. I think 400 or 500 Indians were killed at that point, and very few of Jackson's people.
In the aftermath of this battle, Jackson's men come across this very small child. He's an orphan, and he's sitting there surrounded by the smoke and ruin and bodies of the battlefield. And the child is brought to Jackson, and he's asked, what do you do with the kid? And Jackson decides to adopt the child, sends him to Nashville, and he and Rachel raise the child as their own.
I think, as he said, this child was sent to me for some purpose, and he saw in that child himself as a boy, an orphan.
There's this odd combination of the ferocious warrior who can kill tens, dozens, hundreds of Indians in a battle, and then this tender father who is going to take the helpless child, take him into his family, and raise him as his own. Remarkable character, this Jackson.
Rachel and Andrew raised the child at their Tennessee home, the Hermitage. But the boy they named Lincoln would die at 15 of tuberculosis. Some historians now question Jackson's motives in adopting Lincoln.
Jackson was a good politician. He used this and pointed to it quite a bit in his career as evidence of his benevolent attitude toward Native people.
These historians who say how wonderful he was, well, he adopted an Indian boy. They don't put in there he adopted that Indian boy after he slaughtered their mom and dad.
Upwise.
Following months of fighting with the Indians, Jackson was ready for the climactic battle of Stick Wars. It would take place in an area of the Mississippi Territory which later became Alabama, where a strip of land was surrounded by the Tallapoosa River on 3 sides, Horseshoe Bend. There, 1,000 Red Sticks had built what they hoped was an impenetrable defensive fortification. Jackson wrote about the imposing structure in one of his earliest first-person accounts of his battles.
Nature furnishes few situations so eligible for defense. Across the neck of the land, they had erected a breastwork of greatest compactness and strength, from 5 to 8 feet high, and prepared with rows of portholes very artfully arranged. An army could not approach it without being exposed to a double crossfire from the enemy, who lay in perfect security behind it.
Jackson had only 2 small cannons to attack the fortress, but he had a powerful 1,500-man army, which included his militia, as well as U.S. Army regulars, and strong officers. Lieutenant Sam Houston was among the bravest. General John Coffee, with the aid of Indian interpreter Selokta, would lead an additional force of more than 1,500 Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw Indians who had agreed to fight for Jackson.
Hello.
There were a lot of Indians that were considering their own tribe's self-interest above anything else. Others thought it was worth a gamble, that if they allied themselves with the Americans against the Red Sticks, that maybe the Americans then would leave them alone.
Let's do it, gentlemen.
There is an old Indian expression that if Jackson made war on you, all he had to do was look at you, and you dropped dead. Jackson was not the man that you quarreled with. It's not the man you fought. He's a man who can do great things for you if he has a mind to. He is not a man to be challenged, and certainly not a man to fight against.
Gentlemen, move on down the hill.
On March 27, 1814, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend began.
I detailed Coffee with the Indian force to pass the river at a ford about 3 miles below their encampment, and to surround the bend in such a manner that none of them should escape by attempting to cross the river. With the remainder of the forces, I proceeded along the point of land which leads to the front of the breastwork. And at 10:30 a.m., I had planted my artillery and immediately opened a brisk fire upon its center.
Fire!
It was no surprise to Jackson that his small cannons did little damage to the walls of the Red Stick defense. Jackson's Indian allies chose to distract the Red Sticks by attacking from the rear. Jackson then launched his main army against the heart of the Indian fortification. This frontal assault was led by Houston, who later gained fame in the fight for Texas independence.
A large body of Jackson's force charged this breastwork, and Houston himself got up on it. Got shot twice, got sabred, got speared, got shot with bows and arrows and everything.
The Red Sticks are simply right behind the walls, and so it's at point-blank range. Sam Houston has to be dragged off of the field, bleeding. It looks like he's going to die from his wounds. But through numbers, through determination, Jackson's men managed to force their way across the top of the wall. It's the most bitter fighting imaginable. In fact, it's kind of hard to imagine how it all took place because it went on for hours. The carnage that ensued was horrific. According to eyewitness accounts, the river ran red with the blood of the Indians killed.
Out of Jackson's force of 3,000 Americans and Indians, only 6 men died in the 5-hour battle.
That's really hard to
But
believe.
for the Red
True.
Sticks, Horseshoe Bend was a complete disaster.
Officers who had the best opportunities of judging believed the loss of the enemy not to fall short of 800.
Jackson did not describe in his reports the methods used to determine the exact number of enemy dead.
What we have at the end of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is Jackson's men doing a reliable body count among the hundreds of the slain Indians that lay there on the battlefield.
How do you think they counted them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
By slicing off parts of their noses to keep a reliable count.
Following the battle at Horseshoe Bend, one lone Indian came into Andrew Jackson's camp with a peace offering of a slaughtered deer. It was none other than William Weatherford, the mixed-blood Red Stick leader.
Weatherford decides that he is going to essentially take responsibility for the uprising, for the rebellion, and presents himself to Jackson and says, here I am, essentially as a defeated general.
Mr. Weatherford, I've brought you an offering.
And Jackson doesn't know quite what to make of this at first, but treats Weatherford as defeated, honorable enemy, and lets him go.
Many of Jackson's troops were surprised and angry that Jackson spared Weatherford's life.
Jackson was quite an egomaniac, and he recognized the leadership and the courage of the opponents because that made him more the man. So when William Weatherford came in and talked with him, I have heard through some of the oral traditions that Weatherford said to him, if I had another 800 troops, I would still be fighting you. He would not have given up. And Jackson perhaps took Weatherford's attitude and saw something in it of himself.
Whatever his motivation for releasing Weatherford, Jackson had achieved what white settlers sorely desired, the ability to move west without fear of Indian reprisal. On August 9, 1814, the Treaty of Fort Jackson took from the tribal nations 23 million acres in Georgia and Alabama. The treaty made no allowance for loyalty. Included in the white territory was land belonging to the very Indians who had fought as Jackson's allies.
The terms of that treaty were monstrously unfair, and it took away half the lands of the Creek Nation, very much to the satisfaction, of course, of Jackson.
He didn't see it as, you've done for me and therefore I have to do for you in repayment. All I know is that the Creeks live in this area and they have to be punished, and we are taking away this amount of land. And if you're affected, that's too bad. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is.
In 1814, as Jackson and his forces were battling the Red Sticks in the south, the regular U.S. Army was under intense attack by the British in the northeast.
The War of 1812 has been going on now for almost 3 years, and it hasn't been going well for the United States at all, culminating in a horribly humiliating invasion by the British of the Atlantic seacoast, the occupation of Washington, D.C., the national capital, and the burning of several of the federal buildings.
So the country was extremely unhappy. What they saw was, we're losing this war and we're losing our economy, and it is likely that this little experiment in democracy is not going to survive this conflict.
Andrew Jackson was promoted from Major General of the Tennessee Militia to the same position in the regular U.S. Army. When military leaders in Washington learned Britain might attempt a landing by sea near the city of New Orleans, Jackson and his militia were sent to prepare a defense. He was told an army of 2,000 well-trained soldiers would be waiting for him.
He doesn't have any kind of experience commanding large numbers of troops, but he's the only one they've got, and he's in the area, and so they say, New Orleans, this is your place to shine, this is your place to win or lose.
The British strategy was straightforward. If they controlled the port of New Orleans, they would have easy access to the Mississippi River. One army, moving north up the river, would join another moving south from Canada, splitting the country in half. With the Northeast already under British control, the capture of New Orleans was critical to their plan. No one understood this better than Jackson. He also knew he was about to take on 10,000 of the toughest troops in the world. These same soldiers had defeated Napoleon, led by the same officer who commanded them now, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham. Jackson desperately needed well-trained, organized, combat-tested troops, but what he had was quite different. A few hundred Creole volunteers from New Orleans, the same number of free men of color who escaped slavery in Haiti, a small band of friendly Choctaw Indians, and a couple of thousand backwoods militiamen from Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Of Jackson's 4,000 troops, less than 10% were U.S. regulars. Jackson was outnumbered more than 2 to 1. But his most critical need was artillery. He cleverly sought help from an unlikely man, Jean Lafitte, a French pirate who had plundered hundreds of merchant ships off the shores of Louisiana and Texas, though Lafitte insisted, never an American vessel.
Lafitte offered not only his service as an intelligence officer, but he offered something that Jackson didn't have and could not resist: an almost endless store of gunpowder, flints for the muskets, cannonballs, things that Jackson didn't have and had no way to get.
Despite this new source of weaponry, the odds were stacked against the American mismatched collection of fighters. This didn't bother Jackson.
Jackson was utterly convinced he could win. I'm not sure exactly why he was convinced he could win. A lot of it had to do with he had to win, and therefore he got himself to believe he could win. And gradually he made his troops, his motley array constituted his army, believe that they could win too. And in military affairs, confidence, the expectation of victory, is more than half the battle.
On December 23rd, 1814, British troops came ashore south of New Orleans and encamped on sugar plantations at the edge of the Mississippi River. Jackson took the offensive. As night fell, he marshaled his ragtag army and headed directly for the British camp. Cannoneers opened fire from a ship on the Mississippi, sending the redcoats scrambling for cover. Before the British could react, Jackson's troops were among them, fighting with anything that could be used as a weapon.
Jackson attacked. In a pitch black dark, there was no moon. And what ensued was a melee. Whether it was rifle butts, rifle fire, swords, knives, fists, rocks, guns, strangling hands.
This was not the kind of warfare the British expected. They were accustomed to fighting in daylight, charging in waves that intimidated their enemy. But these were guerrilla-type tactics. After the successful surprise attack, Jackson pulled back and moved to fortify the city's major defenses. Jackson planned to stop the British by taking advantage of the canals, swamps, and terrain surrounding New Orleans. He chose to make his stand 1 mile north of the British camp, which put his army between the city and the enemy, with a river and a swamp protecting his flanks. A drainage canal provided the perfect position to build a parapet, a wall of earth and wood, which could hopefully be built strong enough to repel the most vicious British attack. Jackson ordered his militia to start digging trenches.
Faster, men! Faster!
Under Jackson's stern direction, his parapet fortification began to take shape. Slaves and soldiers worked day and night, side by side. Dirt, dug to form the trench, became a mound to support the parapet, reinforced with wood. The trench itself was filled with water to form a 10-foot wide moat. 4 days passed. Jackson had no idea when the redcoats would charge his parapet. He kept watch from the second floor of a plantation house thanks to a telescope given him by a local astronomer. At night, he continued his guerrilla-style attacks, sending Indians and militia sharpshooters to pick off British sentries.
This constant irritation and stinging operations that would come at you kept you on edge night and day. It was awful. It was very hard on the nerves and on the temperament, and it's really demoralizing.
The British reaction to this was to send a note to Jackson that this behavior was ungentlemanly. And Jackson's response to that was that it was ungentlemanly for the British to be occupying American soil and they should go back where they came from.
On December 28, 18...
Okay, I think we will continue this after the test tomorrow. The test questions that we would have, I think I'm going to change my mind. I'll just be honest with you because I had some extra credit questions I was going to ask. I'll ask them after the movie's over. How about that? So the test tomorrow will be 20 fill-in-the-blank answers. Okay? Make sure you know how to spell the names and make sure you study up so we can get some good grades here.